Hello everyone and welcome to day 2 of this year's RCSLT conference. I hope everyone enjoyed the content yesterday and that you're not too frazzled for another jam-packed day today. I know I introduced myself yesterday, but I'll just reiterate that my name is Amit Kulkarni. I'm the Head of Research and Outcomes at the RCSLT and most importantly for this session, a speech and language therapist by background. And I'm delighted therefore to be chairing this keynote session entitled Dosage Ideas for Optimizing Service Delivery. Within the session today, we'll be presenting a series of lightning talks focusing on the concept of dosage from a few of our clinical areas. And as such, we're very fortunate to feature presentations from Dr. Jackie Benfield, who is Clinical Lead SLT and Stroke and NIHR Clinical Lecturer at the University of Nottingham and Derbyshire Community Health Services. From Professor Marion Brady, who is Professor of Stroke Care and Rehab at Glasgow Caledonian University. From Dr. Pauline Frizzell, who's Senior Lecturer at University College Cork. From Emma Gibbs, Stroke Clinical Lead Speech and Language Therapist at Sheffield Teaching Hospitals NHS Foundation Trust. From Hilary McFall, Professional Lead for Speech and Language Therapy at Southern Health and Social Care Trust Northern Ireland. From Professor Christina McKean, who's a Professor of Child Language Development and Disorders at Newcastle University. From Dr. Jill Titterington, who's a Consultant Speech and Language Therapist and Researcher, a CPD provider, coach and independent practitioner at the Speech Doctor Northern Ireland. And from Derek Munn, our Director of Policy and Public Affairs at the RCSLT. And I'm very aware that that's a very long list, but I'm also aware that that means we're not able to feature presentations on this important topic from every single one of our clinical areas. However, we're really hoping that the session will identify core concepts that are relevant to you, whatever field of speech and language therapy you work in. I'd also like to say before we start, we know that there is a tension between the growing body of evidence around dosage in SLT and the reality of incredibly and increasingly pressurized clinical services. And we know that none of us can simply click our fingers and solve this thorny issue. So we acknowledge this. And our aim in this session is then to reflect upon the clinical services we offer, to consider the latest evidence from a few clinical areas, to hear from practicing clinicians and managers who've drawn from this research, and to focus on top tips we can all go away and consider to maximize the impact of our services. And this includes consideration of local influencing. So I'm very aware we have quite a few presentations and not a huge amount of time. So to maximize the possibility of some time for Q&A at the end, let's get cracking. And I'll start by handing over to Professor Christina McKean, who's going to tell us about the work she's been involved with Dr. Pauline Frizzell and colleagues, which carefully considers what exactly intervention dosage might mean in paediatric speech and language therapy. Over to you, Christina.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Amit. I appreciate that. Yes, I'll crack on. As Amit says, we've got a lot to get through. So what I'm going to do, just to start us off, is to provide a framework, a bit of a framework for ways of conceptualizing dosage, which I hope will support our discussion and our presentations in this keynote session. It does come from paediatric SLT research, so adult models are slightly different, but I think it's a very helpful framework for starting to think about what's involved in dosage as a concept. So as I say, the concept seems relatively intuitive and simple to all of us, but actually it's made up of numerous components, all of which can vary and all of which can influence the effectiveness and the efficiency of the treatment. So, for example, if we think about taking a course of tablets prescribed by our doctor, the doctor can vary the dosage of that in a number of different ways. They can vary how much of the drug is actually in the tablet. They can vary how many tablets we take each day. They can vary at what intervals we take those tablets each day and for how long we take them. And they can also vary actually what's inside the tablet, what's the active ingredients within the tablet that we're going to take. So this analogy of taking tablets is one that I'll return to in a moment to think about speech and language therapy. But what it points up, I think, is the very medical associations which come with the term dosage And I know that this can sometimes feel an uncomfortable fit for speech and language therapy. However, in our research with Dr. Pauline Frizzell and I, when we reviewed the evidence base for interventions for children with developmental language disorder, we found that thinking about these subcomponents of dosage in SLT interventions is really extremely helpful and informative way of considering how the evidence can inform our service delivery and provision. So the model that we applied and developed in our dosage systematic review has got 4 quantitative components. Dose, which is like the amount of drug in each tablet, to just stretch my analogy a little further. Dose frequency, which is like the number of times per day that you take the tablet. Total intervention duration, which is like the number of days that you need to take the tablet to have a full course. And cumulative intervention intensity, which is the total number of tablets that you take to complete the course, as it were. So those are the 4 quantitative components of dosage. And in the model by Warren et al., which we applied, there's also a qualitative component, a descriptive component called dose form. And this is analogous to the content of the drug, as it were, the active ingredients, the chemicals in a drug that are used to induce change. So now to apply these to paediatric speech and language therapy then. When we talk about dose, we mean the number of properly administered teaching episodes that are delivered during a single intervention session. So the number of activities, teaching episodes, actions, which we believe hypothesize are going to make change happen. So in a vocabulary intervention, this might be the number of times the child is exposed to a particular word during book reading, for example, or in an early language intervention, it might be the number of times the child's communicative attempts are recast by the adult, let's say. So dose has got 3 subcomponents in this model. It has the average rate of teaching episodes per unit of time. For example, 1 recast every 30 seconds versus 1 recast every 1 minute. It has the length of the intervention session is also a subcomponent of dose. So is this a 30-minute session or a 45-minute session? And it also considers the distribution or the density of the teaching episodes over the session. So are you giving 15 recasts in 15 minutes or 15 recasts in 30 minutes? Dose frequency, the second quantitative concept, refers to the number of intervention sessions per unit of time. So is this 1 session a week, 1 session a month? What's the frequency? The total intervention duration refers to the total period of time for which the intervention is provided. For example, 6 weeks or 12 weeks or a year. And the cumulative intervention intensity is the product of dose multiplied by dose frequency multiplied by the total intervention duration. So therefore, a client who's receiving 30 recasts in 30-minute sessions given once a week for 6 weeks would have a cumulative intervention intensity of 180 recasts. So that's a bit like your full dosage. What's the full treatment? What's the pack of pills that you need to take for your intervention to actually work? The qualitative aspects of intervention dosage is analogous to the chemicals of the tablets. So Pauline and I talk quite often about what's the active ingredients. What do we hypothesize is actually making a difference in this intervention? And in the most recent framework, dose form is defined as the commonly used techniques, procedures, methods of instruction and intervention contexts that constitute teaching episodes, that constitute an active ingredient. So it's made up of these other components. So we've broken it down into techniques. So these are the specific actions or teaching behaviours thought to have benefit. Into procedures, this is how the techniques are ordered and how they're combined together, because we're rarely only using one technique in an intervention. So this is how it's all put together. Method of instruction refers to the manner in which the techniques are delivered. And in particular, in DLD research, we found a dichotomy between explicit instruction and implicit instruction being quite important within this evidence base. Intervention context, we further broke down into 3 subcomponents. So this is the activity in which the technique or teaching behaviour is being delivered. So is it a shared book reading activity perhaps, or a symbolic play activity? We also look at where the activity sits on the continuum of child-centred versus adult-directed activity. So that's considered in the description of the dosage of the active ingredients. And also we consider the degree of variability or uniformity in the linguistic input or materials used. And I think this will make more sense as Pauline describes some of the evidence that we reviewed and that we learned about what matters in intervention dosage in interventions for children with language disorder. So I'll hand over to Pauline now, who's going to describe what we found.
Thanks, Christina. So obviously there are still gaps in the evidence and we don't have all the answers from our reviews. However, there are some clear findings that emerge, and one of which is the need to ensure that the within session dose and the intervention intensity is high. Whether that's daily or weekly or over 6 or 12 sessions is less important than the overall amount. So if we're to maintain high levels of within session dose, we need to be clear about what constitutes a dose. What is a dose? For example, for a given intervention, therapists need to decide if a dose is only when the child is required to do or say something, or if the input from the therapist, for example, is also a dose. So, or if you're going to divide them up maybe into what might be an expressive dose, so the output from the child, versus a receptive dose, the input from the clinician. So in relation to cumulative intervention intensity, the literature suggests a minimum requirement for children to achieve their goals. So for example, in vocabulary intervention, 36 word exposures per session for 15 sessions was found to be optimal. So that's a total of 540 exposures. And that was found to be optimal for 5 to 6-year-old children with DLD. In a recent study with Susan Ebels, we found that cumulative intensity was what mattered within a morphosyntactic intervention. So we carried out the same treatment, for example, with 10, 20 or 30 within session doses and keeping the overall session length constant. And the people who got the 30 doses per session, they did reach their goals more quickly. But importantly, those with lower doses got there in the end. It just took longer. So this again speaks to the fact that if you only have 6 weeks, you need to make sure that the within session dose is high in order to optimize the impact. I suppose another thing to say is that previously there was some literature suggesting that spaced learning was more effective than more concentrated learning. There's a lot of literature out there looking at this, so that the idea of giving children time to consolidate is more effective. And this would be an argument, for example, to see somebody fortnightly. But we now know that overall dose appears to have greater impact on children's learning than the frequency of the treatment schedule. So it means perhaps that we don't have to be quite so concerned about the frequency of the treatment schedule as long as we consider what the overall dose is. There's also some tentative evidence that the same results can be achieved in a shorter time frame if the within session dose remains the same and reasonably high. So for example, there's one study where they looked at 24 recasts in 15 minutes versus 24 recasts in 30 minutes, and they got the same result. And that's obviously a very significant finding. Now we do need to have more literature, more research carried out in that area, but the idea that we can save actually quite a bit of time, particularly if you're working in kind of a school context, that you could achieve the same result as long as you keep the within session dose to a critical minimum. It's also it seems that weekly or fortnightly sessions are acceptable dose frequency schedules, but only if the dose, as I said, per session is high. And little and often is also potentially effective. So there is some flexibility in scheduling to accommodate parents or educational practitioners. So I suppose really we can make a range of models work if we pay attention to the within session dose. And the other thing to say is that more is not always better. So this is I suppose, a surprising fact for a lot of us, because we always would have thought that more would be better, but too high a dose can actually result in these diminishing returns. So potentially caused by reduced attention when a target becomes overly familiar. So the literature, and we would suggest that if progress plateaus, that you would change the intervention target. Unfortunately, there's no magic number for dose or session frequency across language domains, but we do have sufficient evidence to suggest that we really have to move away from the practice of delivering a number of predetermined intervention hours or sessions. And that continuing treatment until a child reaches a pre-specified criterion for success, that's an approach that aligns more closely with the evidence. So we also need to think really critically about the ethicality of removing a child from a classroom or asking parents to bring children to therapy for an intervention that is not given at sufficient dosage to affect change. And we really need to make sure that our service delivery models are driven where we can by evidence and not by custom and practice. Could I just go on to the next slide there, please, Christina? Of course, there is an interaction between what we do quantitatively and what we do qualitatively. So we provided a framework of qualitative, direct therapy-focused active ingredients, if you like. And we know that subtle but simple manipulations of these active ingredients can really enhance the efficacy of what we do. So for example, Christina mentioned around the uniformity and the variability of what we present. So we know that varying the referent in vocabulary interventions, so having 3 or 4 different images of a duck, for example, is much more effective than having a very similar presentation of a duck every time you present that. We also consider the order in which we do things to matter. So there's some literature out there showing that if you provide auditory bombardment of a target, like a morphosyntactic structure, after recasting, that's more beneficial. So we need to consider, because as Christina said, we never have just one technique, but we need to consider the order and the relevance of that order as to how efficient our intervention is. We also know that using explicit teaching at the start of an intervention followed by implicit practice as children get older is also effective. And ensuring that children have the opportunity to produce target forms seems to be something that is certainly also, if we offer those opportunities, that enhances our efficacy. And I suppose the other thing to say is, while we provided a framework thinking about direct active ingredients, of course there are also many other qualitative active ingredients, such as building rapport with the parent or the child that you're working with. Such as who delivers the therapy, is it done in a group or is it done individually? So we acknowledge that all of those active ingredients are also there, but we were considering the more direct ones for the framework. And I'll finish just by saying that we will soon embark on a very large piece of consensus work to agree internationally on the active ingredients of therapy, how we define them, who the participants are in our research, so that we can make sure to include underserved groups that are often excluded, and that research participants will match more closely to those on your caseloads. And also to develop a set of internationally agreed and functional outcomes for children. And we'll be engaging with lots of therapists throughout that process, so I ask you to watch this space. And now I'm going to hand over to Jill and Hilary.
Thank you, Pauline. Hilary and I are delighted to be here this morning to talk to you about dosage for children with speech sound disorder. And I'm going to start off by looking at the evidence base for dosage for this client group, because there are important differences to what we've heard for DLD or language disorder. But like Christina and Pauline were saying, the fundamental active ingredients to get right in the first instance is the dose form. And we know that getting the right treatment and targets for the right child will produce the right outcomes when we're looking at speech sound disorder. So let's look at the other evidence for dosage aspects for children with speech sound disorder, looking across different subtypes of speech sound disorder and ranging from moderate to severe speech sound disorder. We see that the evidence is emerging that indicates we'll get optimal results for these children if we provide a target dose of 50 to 100 or more target trials per session, delivered with a frequency of 2 to 3 sessions per week, over an intervention duration of 18 to 36 sessions or sometimes more. And we know from the literature that children with more severe speech sound disorder will benefit optimally from the higher ends of the dosages shown here on the slide. So we see that there's a big gap between what is happening in the research literature and generally what's provided in practice. But I think our message today is that there's evidence emerging that different models of service delivery have promise in terms of what can help us bridge that gap. And this morning we're going to look at increasing dose frequency and duration of direct therapy for children with severe speech sound disorder through a quality improvement project. And I'll hand you over to Hilary. Hilary, I think you're on mute.
Somebody had to do it, didn't they? So our project is a quality improvement project, so it's not research. However, what quality improvement methodology does is provide a very robust framework to support services to implement learning from research into a clinical context. So prior to the project, children with speech sound disorder in our trust received 6 weekly intervention with 1 appointment per week. On average, there were 30 trials per session. And once the 6 weeks had completed, they then went on an 8-week break and sometimes longer, and they then circled back into another 6-week block, and that continued until the children no longer required speech and language therapy. And what we found was that children were making slow and variable progress, likely due to the low dose in the sessions, the time between the appointments, and also the time scale of the duration of the intervention. It's likely that children were not able to build on their learning from session to session and therefore weren't able to change their patterns of speech. We knew that parents were frustrated with the service that they were receiving, and also our speech and language therapists were dissatisfied with what they were able to provide. So our QI project aimed to provide children with a minimum of 70 trials per session, twice weekly appointments with a speech and language therapist, and a 12-week duration of intervention. And we hypothesised that this would result in more sustained improvement. So we had 10 children aged 4 and 5 years who had no other comorbidities but had a diagnosis of severe speech sound disorder, which was measured by a performance of up to and equal to 1 percentile on the DEEP, or a score of less than 3 in the intelligibility in context scale.
So now let's come to the outcomes. And if we look at the dosage that the children received during the QI project, they received a mean dose of 88 target trials per session across a mean of 14 sessions, ranging from 10 to 17 sessions. And as we know, the intervention duration was 12 weeks. Now, if we look back at what dosage these children received before they actually came into the project, that's really interesting. So as Hilary said, they received a dose of around 30 to 50 target trials. But look here, interestingly, this was over a mean of 18 sessions, ranging from 7 to 26 sessions. Looks like these children received more therapy than they actually did once they got into the QI project. But the model of service delivery meant that those 18 sessions were delivered over 88 weeks, ranging from 40 to 172 weeks. So we feel the important take-home message about this package is that the children in the QI project received less overall intervention, but it was provided in a more evidence-based package. So let's see if that actually impacted on their speech outcomes, which, as you remember, were slow and variable. So this chart shows the percentage constants correct on the vertical axis, and each participant is represented by a single line with all the dots on it, and each dot is a percentage constants correct measure. So if we look at how the children did over the project, we see that they made, as a group, a mean increase of 28% consonants correct, ranging from 11 to 53. And if we look at the intervention literature and research, that's a very promising outcome. I'll hand you back to Hilary.
Parents were a key component of our QI project, and they committed to doing home practice a minimum of 5 times a week. So it was a big commitment from the parents of these children, and these are just some of the comments that they made on completion of the project. So in conclusion, the things that we found was that increasing dose to 70 trials per session was actually an easy win. This was not difficult to achieve. The therapists that did the project achieved this without any real challenge. Also, supporting parents to understand how to continue to practice at home was a key factor. Also, providing these children with evidence-based dosage of service delivery actually increases the efficiency for the speech and language therapy service. Whilst initially high in speech and language therapy time, the treatment tail is well reduced. So children become intelligible quicker and the impact of their speech sound disorder is greatly reduced. And my last point would be really just to say, for those of you working in a health service, is be courageous. It actually takes a bit of courage to take the leap to changing the model of service delivery, but it will make a massive difference for the children in your service and their families. Thank you. I'm going to pass you over now to Marion Brady.
Hi there. Sorry, I don't seem to have the slides. Thank you. If you could advance them, thank you. So I'm here to introduce the next 3 speakers, myself and Jacqueline Benfield and Emma Gibbs, and we'll be all talking about adult SLT rehabilitation and dosage. Could you advance the slide, please? Right, so we are going to be talking about aphasia after stroke and dosage. Jacqueline will talk about dysphagia after stroke and dosage, and Emma will be talking about the practicalities of implementing some of the findings in relation to dosage in practice. So in the adult field, in discussing this session, we discovered that we have slightly different definitions across our various areas of clinical expertise and practice. And so in the next 3 talks, this talk and the next 2 talks, we'll be talking about dosage in the context of the total number of SLT therapy hours provided to the individual. Intensity in our context means the total number of SLT hours provided per week, and frequency relates to the total number of therapy days per week. So as one example of some of the research emerging in this field in the context of aphasia after stroke is some work from a project called the Release Project, which was a large international collaboration which gathered together information from just under 6,000 people with aphasia. That's 5,928 individual participants' data. And from that large database, we drew down various data sets around people's performance on language outcomes, the number of therapy hours that they received, the amount of dosage of therapy, and their baseline severity and time post-stroke and other elements of demographics. And in analysing that, we looked at the influence of dosage in the context of recovery across different language outcomes. And this is just one example in the context of auditory comprehension. The QR code is there to the main paper, which provides a lot more information, but this is just a snapshot. So this auditory comprehension forest plot relates to 540 individual participants' data from across 16 different randomized controlled trials. The measures of gain from baseline is at the vertical 0 line, but the measures in gain reflect points of performance on the Alcan Aphasia Test Token Test, which is a scale of 0 to 50. And you can see that each row reflects the amount of speech and language therapy, the dosage of speech and language therapy individual participants received. So the first row there reflects people who received 5 hours of therapy in total or less in the trial. that reflected 64 individuals received that level of intervention across 3 randomized controlled trials. And you can see that there was no significant gain associated with that level of intervention. In fact, the only significant gains, or the main significant gains, were associated with at least 20 hours of therapy, up to 50 hours of therapy in that range. And you can see that that was associated with a mean gain of 5.23 on the token test, with a confidence interval of 1.5 to 8.9. So that's just one example of the association of dosage with gains in auditory comprehension. So this is a summary of similar forest plots across that research, where we saw that similar gains were associated with, the maximum gains were associated with therapy that was provided between 20 to 50 hours in total dosage on measures of overall language, functional communication, and auditory comprehension. And in relation to frequency, we saw that the optimum gains were associated with therapy that was provided 4 to 5 days per week, and intensity of 2 to 4 hours per week, with the exception of the maximum gains associated with the auditory comprehension, where they were associated with therapy of in excess of 9 hours per week. I'm going to hand over to Jacqueline.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to focus now on dosage in post-stroke dysphagia rehabilitation. So currently, what are we doing? So speech therapists see patients for about 31 minutes on about half of their inpatient days following a stroke. But that's not just about dysphagia rehab. That's all the things that speech therapists do with dysphagia and communication. So we're focusing really on dysphagia rehabilitation, exercises and interventions to improve the swallow, not just manage or compensate for it. A few years ago, a survey of speech therapists, they reported they were providing 15 to 20 minute sessions 1 to 5 times a week. And recently in focus groups, speech pathologists in Australia reported they felt that more therapy was better. And there may be some evidence to show that patients may not be able to tolerate too longer sessions, especially in the acute stage. So that's something that needs to be considered. What should we be doing? So the evidence shows that behavioural exercises probably improve dysphagia. And looking at the models and the dosage that's included in those trials that result in these gains shows that there's high frequency of intervention, so 5 days a week. Intensity varies, and here there's a move to be reporting, especially for exercise, behavioural exercises, to just talking about intensity as repetitions of exercise, learning from the motor learning and neuroplasticity literature. And then duration, again, having quite a range of durations, but certainly this is a lot more than what's actually being delivered in clinical practice. There's current research looking into dose, a trial that I'm running in acute stroke around swallow therapy. And then there's other groups looking at what the core ingredients or the core components of therapy are, such as exercise type, challenge of the exercise, and the use of biofeedback. So another area of intervention is neurostimulation. So TDCS, TMS, and NMES, they've all got a growing evidence base, but there's a high kind of heterogeneity or range of the dose that's being delivered as part of trials, and also the sort of core components such as the strength of intensity or location of stimulation. So optimal dosing is unknown. Pharyngeal electrical stimulation is slightly different. It's been developed in a more stepwise way, looking at dosing across sort of in the development of the intervention. So a little bit more closely able to understand what dosing might be the best and the optimal dosing for this intervention, but it's being tested in increasingly larger clinical trials. Given that our field is quite new, it's really important that we should be also looking to other research around motor learning and neuroplasticity. Following a review of the literature, the NICE guidelines recommended that therapy for motor and physical gains after stroke should be delivered at 1 to 2 hours per day. So certainly intensity is important, but still even there, the total dose is unknown. And then also looking to this literature that also helps us to understand what the core components, what the key ingredients of therapy may be in order to maximise motor learning and neuroplasticity. So in summary, 20 to 50 hours of aphasia rehab results in best gains. The dosing for dysarthria and dysphagia is unknown. The optimum dose is unknown. There seems to be a minimum dose under which treatment may not be effective, and intensity seems to be important, and also the core components of therapy are important, but again, unclear what they need to be in dysphagia rehab. In the development and refinement of interventions, concepts of dosing, feasibility and implementability need to be considered from the early stages of development of interventions, so that we really know what we're doing and what's effective, and we're not doing things that are not effective. And when we're implementing as clinicians these interventions, we need to be considering what the dose is that they were tested at, and in order to implement them correctly in our practice. Thank you. And now over to Emma.
Thank you. Good morning. Some fairly speedy reflections on applying slide, please. Thank you. On applying these definitions and this evidence from Jackie and Marion into our often time-limited and busy stroke services. So next slide, please. In stroke, we are very used to measuring our input in minutes and working against targets in minutes, and that's been helpful in pushing up our general intervention levels sometimes. But we all know that those targets, as Jackie mentioned, include all aspects of our input, our assessment, our management, all different areas that we're working on. And even when we can specifically relate these targets to therapy, they're appropriate for some of our patients at some points in their recovery. So thinking about the what is part of it, but also how are we delivering these minutes in practice? Who's contributing to the dose? When is the right time? So this knowledge of our evidence base and these summaries today are so helpful, and our national guidelines help inform us as well, both at a specific patient individual level and at a service level. How is our service set up to provide particular therapies at the right dosage? We're all in stroke currently looking at our services under the lens of the various new guidelines last year and this year. And despite some ambiguity on timings that colleges are helping us to resolve, we can use these very specifically as a guide to show us when the evidence behind a new therapy is sufficient to then plough our service improvements to create the space for that therapy or method at the right dosage. And a good example of that is the potential use of high intensity ICAPs for some patients, or the evidence that Marion mentioned about auditory comprehension therapy, and being selective in our intensity for the appropriate therapy. So in terms of when, recent guidelines were telling us about opportunities for people with aphasia to improve their communication skills long term while ever they're making meaningful gains. And that's quite a wide gulf from what's available in most of our NHS long-term stroke services. So we need that flexibility to provide the right dosage at the right time for that individual with everything else that's going on in their stroke recovery. And that isn't something we've necessarily had a lot of in our pathways. And it isn't something that our targets particularly support either. But it is, that flexibility does align with the service user feedback we get again and again. And it does align with the evidence around potential long-term therapy gains for our patients. So who is delivering the therapy? Many of us have created models with a skill mix within our SLT clinical team, and within our wider team, some of the integrated working models on units extend competencies for the whole team to make every contact count. And we are increasingly seeing other innovations, often to increase the length of our input into the long term, with third sector partners, such as charities and volunteers, for example, those offering supported app-based therapy and devices, or conversation partner schemes with students and trained volunteers. But how do we do that? So it's such a huge question, isn't it? But technology is one part of it, and something I just wanted to mention. It plays a part for many of our therapies, but not all of them, and for many of our patients in therapy and in other ways. And the hardware and software IT resource that we have available within our service does matter, and in our experience has transformed some of our practice. So being able to transition to and support self-directed practice outside of sessions, which we know is a key way to increase the rehab hours, is massively supported by having the right tech and apps early. And so finally, that patient empowerment over their own rehab, where we know that functionally relevant items and personalised therapy targets get better outcomes. And we know that supported self-management and improved self-efficacy from early on improves control and decision-making and mood, which supports people's engagement and hence their dosage in therapy and their outcomes. So with our huge range of very specific therapies in stroke and with variable levels of evidence on their dosage or active ingredients, we just want to make this input as effective and not, it always stayed with me, David Howard's quote years ago about homeopathic dosages of speech therapy. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm Jake Mann. I'm the Director of Policy and Public Affairs at the Royal College. Many of you will know me as being responsible for the work of the Royal College in respect of political influencing, policy change, and supporting local advocacy too. And I was asked to reflect very briefly on, I've called it when dosage gets political, where the strong scientific evidence that we've just heard from our research and clinical contexts comes up in the work that I do, either in national influencing or supporting speech and language therapists in local influencing. And I picked out three which relate to things we've already heard. The first would be the 6-week block and the arguments we have to make around why this is not evidence-based, why we have to say, what is it that a particular child needs in respect of dosage and intervention, rather than a one-size-fits-all. The second is where we've talked about post-stroke and people saying, tell us how much we need. You talked about minutes, Marion. Tell us exactly how much we need, and not just for stroke, for other particularly neuro conditions as well. And having to make the case within saying we don't do a medical model for saying actually exactly what Pauline said, an unefficacious dose is not ethical, and you've got to you've got to be able to make that case strongly. But the third thing, which I put in inverted commas, which again you spoke about, Pauline, particularly when we're working with advocates for people with lived experience for whom we work and their families and carers, it's natural to think that if some speech therapy is good, more speech therapy must be better. And it can be helpful to talk about the analogy of pills or the analogy of saying you need the right amount, not too much, in making that case. Why does this matter? It matters because in your local influencing and resource, I was going to say battles, conversations, it's easy for us as researchers and clinicians to think this is what the evidence says. But if I'm a decision maker or a budget holder, my decision making hierarchy is different. Firstly, what have I legally got to provide? Secondly, what mandates have I been given? If I've been told my priority is to reduce waiting lists and waiting times, that means I just want to see as many people as possible, as quickly as possible. Thirdly, how much money have I got? And fourthly, what pressure is coming on me from stakeholders? And it's only once I've got through that that I can turn to what does the evidence say? And that's where I think the language and evidence of dosage can help us to make the case that we need to for the right and correct level of provision. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of our speakers. There's so many fantastic ideas from the evidence base, from the application of those ideas into practice, and then at the end there from Derek as to ways we can use all of this to try to influence for the best possible services. We've had so many questions come in, so many interesting questions, and I'm aware we don't have a huge amount of time for Q&A. So I'm going to start by asking some themed questions, and then if we do have time, we'll go on to specific ones. I just want to start by asking all speakers, so please feel free, whoever would like, please come in. I think we've all talked about ensuring that the dosage that's provided is sufficiently high. I know there's the flip side of that, where there is the concept of diminishing returns and that more is not always better. But we have talked about, for example, keeping within dosage session high. But what about the other aspects of the therapy session, rapport building, etc.? Could we just have some comments on the importance of these?
Can I come in? I'll come in there if that's helpful. So yeah, this model is very medicalized, as you say. It's a medical model, but if you think in other models of thinking about interventions, so I don't know if some people are aware of realist models, then what we're talking about here is the mechanisms of the intervention, but also the context within which the intervention happens is also influences how much your mechanisms actually will work. And if we can perhaps conceptualize the relationship between the SLT and the family or the person perhaps as the context, and you need that to be good if the other mechanisms are actually going to be effective. So obviously this is one part of therapy, and therapy is a much more complex thing than just dosage. So we're not saying, you know, drill somebody whether or not they hate you. We're saying once you have this context within which you can work with that family, then make the dosage that you deliver as optimal as possible, but not ignoring these other aspects that are vital to SLT.
I think that's such an important message. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, Anne, I was just going to add that, like, I think as well, just a recognition that things like rapport are an active ingredient of therapy can make clinicians and make us all feel validated in spending time establishing that, that this is not just, it's not chit chat, this is part of the therapeutic process, and it's as important as many other aspects, and it's sort of to validate that as being part, as Christina said, of the intervention context.
Thank you. And I was just going to say, I think exactly that it's really great to hear the value that your work maintains on the therapeutic relationship and all aspects of the intervention. And this is not just some kind of counting of specific, although there is a need to maximize specific production and comprehension of target items, it's not just about that. We've heard as well, we had a couple of questions around the sort of person delivering the intervention. So again, just to all speakers, do you have reflections on therapy delivered by professionals other than speech and language therapists? Does this count as exactly the same in terms of dosage, or is this any different? I think Marion, you would like
Thanks,
to
Amit. We've got some good evidence in the context of SLT for aphasia that has evaluated, there are several trials out there that have evaluated the difference between an SLT delivering face-to-face therapy versus a non-SLT. So it may be a family member or a volunteer or another trained person who is given a SLT developed program of work, who's trained by the SLT to deliver that work to the individual, and there's no evidence of a difference between that model and an SLT actually doing the delivery of the therapy on every occasion.
That's so interesting, and I wonder if Christina or Pauline, or Jill, you want to comment from the paediatric side, because I know there is still lots of discussion around universal, targeted and specialist services to draw from those traditional terms.
Yes, just briefly, in the area of speech sound disorder, I think there are good arguments, although not enough research yet, for the tiered approach that, universal targeted specialist, and definitely a strong argument that children with more severe speech sound disorder do need the very specialist input that's our unique selling point in terms of speech sound disorder as well.
Christina, do you have your hand up?
Yes, just to add to that, I think what this work really points up is that we need to be really clear what our active ingredients is in the intervention if we're going to ask somebody else to deliver it for us. So it makes us have to be much more precise about what it is that we want to happen within a session. And I think that if we can do that and train people to deliver that, then it's okay that it's somebody else, but we do need to be really clear what that is that we want people to do.
Fantastic. I'm so sorry, but we are running out of time. I don't know about whether this is the same for others, but I just think this has been a fascinating session. It's given me as a clinician so many interesting sort of points to reflect upon. I said at the start that we know we can't simply click our fingers to solve the difficulties that exist in clinical services, but I really hope that the ideas that have been discussed today, for some of the things we can control, for example, like the active ingredients of our interventions, how we can optimize within the sessions, are really important things to consider. And just to reiterate, we really know that service delivery is tough. It was tough before COVID. It's even tougher now. But we know that everyone here is completely dedicated to serving people with communication and swallowing needs. And we hope that we can reflect upon these discussions today to optimize our interventions, our service delivery, and our local influencing to provide the best possible support for those that we serve. So we're now going to go into a short break until 10:40. And after that, we'll have our next 6 parallel sessions, which will take place. Please do use the break to network amongst yourselves, to speak to our sponsors and exhibitors, and don't forget about the gamification elements of the conference. I mean, you could win yourself an incredibly exciting prize. And as a reminder, all sessions will be recorded, so if you miss anything, you'll be able to watch it back at a later stage. Thanks so much, everyone.